Welcome and thanks for joining us in The Loop, the podcast where we engage with policy makers, policy wonks, managers and leaders to reflect on the enormous agenda facing health and care in England. And by we, I mean the two of us, Neil Dixon, that's me, a former broadcaster and one-time chief executive of the NHS Confederation, the General Medical Council and the King's Fund.
And this is Roy Lilly, who was a grateful customer at one stage of the King's Fund when I first became a trust chairman and was confused of Camberley. I went to the King's Fund and I went on to fame and glory only because of my association with the King's Fund.
Well, our guest this time is Sarah Woolnough, who's the chief executive of the King's Fund, my former stomping ground. Sarah spent 15 years at Cancer Research UK, was seconded in 2011 to the Department of Health to write the National Cancer Strategy alongside Sir Mike Richards. And before joining the fund, she was chief executive of Asthma Plus Lung UK, the national respiratory charity. Sarah has campaigned strongly on issues such as plain packaging of tobacco and for bolder clean air laws. She is an enthusiast for prevention, early diagnosis and community care, as well as the adoption and spread of innovation across the health and care system. All key elements, incidentally, within the 10-year plan, though, as she says herself, it's the gap between great policy ideas and implementation that is one of the biggest challenges. The King's Fund has a long history of supporting leaders, as Roy has just reflected, both clinical and managerial, and everyone accepts that if the NHS is to thrive and indeed survive, those leaders will be critical. But the message, endorsed by Jennifer Dixon of the Health Foundation and other think tank boss when we spoke to her, is that the current leadership cohort is fragile and certainly among the medics incredibly disillusioned. It'll be interesting to hear what Sarah has to say about that. And what about her relationship with government? The Secretary of State has sounded somewhat impatient about charities moaning, I don't know if he used that word, but certainly lobbying, as he put it, and he did not like the King's Fund's questioning aspects of his shiny new league tables. We've talked to previous guests about the new 10-year Fit for the Future plan and its wonderful words, but it's being pushed by a government already in deep trouble, led by a Prime Minister with a massive majority who incredibly looks shaky after not much more than a year in the job, and a Chancellor whose credibility appears to be severely undermined. And of course, in the last week, a Deputy Prime Minister and a US Ambassador who are no more. The NHS needs strong advocates and funding, social care reform and a clear timetable. I imagine Roy will want to know what Sarah thinks about all that and how realistic it will be to deliver all this.
Well, it's a really good question, Neil. We all know what the problems are. And the question for me is, well, what can a think tank actually do about any of that? Is anybody listening to them anymore? Do they have any clout anymore? In the days of SPADs and focus groups and all the rest of it, do they really have a place in the world? What's the point of the King's Fund? And, well, I guess we'll find out.
Sarah, welcome to In the Loop. I wonder if I could begin, and this may be a bit of a frightful cheek coming from someone who did your job 20 years ago, but do you think tanks make any difference? Is government or anyone else listening to what you have to say? And indeed, have you anything different to tell them that they've not thought of before?
It is a reasonable question to ask of think tanks. And certainly since I arrived a year and a half ago, we have kind of gone back to first principles, gone back to our Royal Charter and our charitable purpose and looked at what we exist to do and how we can make a difference. I, don't historically come from think tank world. I spent most of my career in public-facing medical research charities, hungry and impatient for change. And I think the King's Fund today is hungry and impatient for change. Each think tank is a little bit different. But from our perspective, we've got a new strategy. And what we're trying to do is be both think and do tank, or certainly pay as much attention to how you drive change and deliver change and implement strategy as ideate, because so many of the ideas that we are trying to drive into our health and care system, or the changes we're trying to drive, aren't new. The difficulty often comes in the implementation and the how. So we are trying to be impatient and hungry for change and play a really constructive role in the system, which is ideas, yes, but it's also commentary on the how. Because we train health and care leaders as well as produce policy research analysis, hopefully we've got feedback loop. We're hearing from people every day out in the system or in the building of the King's Fund how ideas are landing or not, how they may be driving them into practice, or the difficulty doing so.
Let me ask about the relationship with the Secretary of State and the government as a whole. There seemed to be some disquiet in government circles about your comments on their shiny new league tables.
The beauty of an organisation like the King's Fund is we are independent, we have longevity, we will try to be constructive, but, we can say what we think. And we were very polite in our kind of commentary on the league tables, or which was to say, I'm a great believer in getting information out there in the public domain, but we've got to be a bit careful about what a really simplistic label on a hospital, good or bad, or, where it's in the ranking. Plus, I was a bit confused about really what they were trying to do. If they were trying to give patients and people choice, then it's rather odd to overlay a financial rating on the ranking. As I say, I've spent a lot of my time working with people and patients trying to help them understand the health and care system and drive improvements in care from their perspective. I had a play around with those tables. I was none the wiser about where I might choose to get my cancer treatment or have a baby through looking at them. Sort of back to your question, it's really important that we're able to say what we think, and we'll try and do so in a polite and constructive way. And I don't want to be someone who just sort of lobs in and is constantly critical for its own sake, because if you go back to our charitable purpose, it's to improve the health of the people of England. We're here to drive positive change. But we've got to be able to say when we think an intervention or a policy, won't make much difference.
I think Sarah, you put your finger on it with the league tables. They're horribly weighted by the finance thing. And then you get a hospital like the Chelsea in Westminster, one of the best hospitals we have, internationally famous. And suddenly it finds itself on number 47 or whatever it was on the list, simply because it's doing more care than it's paid for, and it's needed a bit of a bailout from the department. That is disgraceful, it's dishonest, and it's deceptive. And I don't think you can hit Streeting hard enough with trying to make him wake up to what a useless idea it is. If you're going to do that, you just take the finance bit out of it and publish a different set of league tables. And then you find out if anywhere is any good. So when you said earlier, what you exist to do, and you said, well, it's change. And what change does the King's Fund want? Is it just wrapped up in making a commentary on what other people want for change? Or can I look at the King's Fund's map of the NHS in 10 years' time?
What we're trying to do is drive change against key priorities. So we've got a new strategy, and we talk about creating good health. We talk about shifting the dial on social care. We talk about putting people first. So when we're at our best, I think we are able to convene really powerfully. So it is about sometimes learning from the best performing places in the world, having a strong international network and dialogue. But it's also about using the full range of capabilities that we have, which is both deep understanding of the system, understanding the trends and the change we want to drive, but then really thinking about how
what change, what change do you want to drive? That's the question.
Many of the shifts that the government talks about are not new. Successive governments, successive commentators, including the think tanks and including the King's Fund, for example, care closer to home, we have long argued for. What I want is a health and care system fit for a 2025 and beyond population.
If I may just interrupt you. You talked about social care. We all know the NHS can't really sort itself out until the social care is sorted out. But that's after the next election. If Labour get in next time, we know that Labour have parked social care. So there's no point in saying, well, we've got to fix social care, because the people who can fix social care say, thanks very much, we're not going to do it now. You've got to wait 4 years. So what I'm really trying to get at is, where is your traction?
Well, I think you're asking a couple of different questions. I think I'd say on social care, I would sort of disagree that we haven't got a really important role to play. I think we go really fast on some things and a bit slower on others. Social care, absolutely right, they've parked it. We know we have a social care system that is not fit for purpose. it is an opportunity, and it's not going to happen overnight, but the work we're doing at the moment is really trying to learn from other parts of the world, is to form a position which may be fundamentally different to where we've been in the past. And I don't want to kind of second guess that work, but do we need social insurance? Do we need to think really radically differently about this issue at the moment, where you've got rationing, you've got more people asking for help and fewer receiving help, and you do have a fundamental money problem in that there's not enough inputs for an aging population needing some sort of assistance. So on that, we'll go slower, and maybe we'll fall more into a think tank that's taking its time, that's understanding the evidence, that's learning from other places. On other issues, you take public health. I think the government's had a disappointing first year. If you go back and read the manifesto and the mission document, we've been promised a prevention revolution, and it's sort of vanished. This idea of health in all policies, which there's a strong evidence base to support. So on that issue, we'll be noisier. We are moving into a sphere of, I suppose, advocating for change rapidly. But look, I suppose, why should people listen to us? It's because we have married a deep understanding of the health and care system with a really strong global network, so we can understand and learn from others and share, with also a really good understanding of what it feels like trying to drive change today. And that's because we talk to health and care leaders, social care system workers, voluntary and community sector leaders all the time. And the power is in the feedback loop, and the power is in that understanding.
Let me just go on this question of prevention. You've been a champion of prevention. Interestingly enough, Jennifer Dixon, when we spoke to her, warned that if the NHS embraced primary prevention, went down that route, there was a real danger of diverting attention from other key priorities, and that was probably not the answer. There was certainly things in secondary prevention that she would very much advocate, but this kind of, we can solve all the world's problems, we can stop making people sick and all the rest of it, with ridiculous ambitions, which then end up simply diverting money away from people who are acutely ill. Do you recognise that danger, if I can put it that way, in your comment about disappointment that the government hasn't done enough?
Well, I think it's government's job more broadly to promote health. And so I think that's where there's been a lack of action and disappointment. The idea of having a cross-government, powerful health mission where you genuinely think about health in all policies, population health, stagnating life expectancy, healthy life expectancy declining in certain groups, European outlier, population health trends are very poor. I do think there's more of a role for the NHS. If I think of my previous roles, I ran the National Respiratory Charity. What did we face day in, day out? Respiratory conditions linked to poor damp housing, lack of vaccination, driving hospital attendance. It was the social determinants writ large. So, of course, a lot of that is outside the NHS, but there is, of course, a role for the NHS to say, we want to keep you well. We want to help you manage a long-term condition. Many more of us are living with multiple long-term conditions. And if it works well, and where I've seen it work best, you do have this integrated housing and health and education working together. So the NHS has a role, but it is much broader. And that's where I think government's missing a trick.
Is this not about how the NHS is organised? I thought ICBs, as much as they were born at an awful time and born into debt and poverty, and they were run by people who didn't have a great deal of experience, and we're kind of getting rid of them by saying you've got to cut your budget by 50% by Christmas, so sack half your staff, we don't care which half it is. And now, of course, regions are coming in. And regions, it looks obvious to me, regions are going to be the key players. ICBs will be subsumed into regions, and regions will run local healthcare systems that will be dominated by secondary care. You can see it coming. If we're organised properly, we would have the influence in other spheres. But at the moment, so much of this is local government, which we have no real relationship other than just passing the debt between us. And that says local mayors. Think what you could do if Andy Burnham ran the healthcare system in Manchester. Is that the kind of thinking we're looking to the King's Fund for?
So Andy Burnham was at the King's Fund last week, and I have to say it was a very uplifting session hearing about what they're trying to do in Manchester through Live Well. Because I've been out and I have seen fantastic examples across the country of people trying to work differently, more integration, thinking end to end about how you keep people well, how you're more proactive in trying to identify illness, how you're genuinely supporting their needs across employment and housing and education as well as health. But it's hard, the system incentives work in often opposite directions. And there are a whole range of sort of challenges and blockers, one being data. So I've been out to see some local authority staff sat next to NHS staff working on completely different systems, having to look over one another's shoulder as opposed to genuinely integrating. So, yeah, there are models. And I think what Andy and co are trying to do in Manchester is really exciting. I think your point on ICBs is a good one as well, though. This idea born into a storm. And then we've got lots of testimony from ICB leaders saying, I came into the job to really try to drive population health improvement. And all this other stuff that's landed on me means I haven't got to that.
What evidence is there, Sarah, that the ICBs have actually succeeded in doing anything? And I think the harder question to ask of Andy, who's been certainly talking about this agenda, though you could argue he doesn't actually pull the NHS levers, but there are, as I understand it, not everything is going swimmingly well in Manchester in terms of health and care.
I think ICBs have been dealt a difficult hand. I have seen, and there is good evidence around the country of pilots, small projects. So I was out with the health and care workers in West London, talking me through and showing me this proactive model of primary care, keeping people at home. They're joining up services. They've got very impressive A&E reduction. It's relatively small. And I think the big challenge is, can we genuinely do it at scale? I mean, we've done some evaluation work in Manchester over the years, which has generally been pretty positive. I think one of the lessons is the effort that it takes to begin to bend the curve and not underestimating how hard it is to tackle some of the really deep systemic inequalities, what poverty is driving, for example. So there's good evidence that interventions of this nature make a difference. Can we scale them, and can we genuinely release resource in other parts of the system to enable us to create the capacity to do more of this? I think that's hard.
Do you think overall that the reorganisation, we've talked about quite a bit of this at the podcast, is actually A, going to work, and B, is it going to even be beneficial? Because there's a lot of concern about the impact that it's having on staff, on the distraction that it'll cause, and remembering that it won't be long until we're saying this government's been in 2 years of a 5-year term. So time rushes on very quickly. Meanwhile, the health service and a lot of its senior staff are looking at the names on the doors and thinking, what's my job going to be if I've got one?
Yeah, well, a couple of points. So Wes's speech to the BMA, there's a really interesting line in it where he says, so I simply cannot fix everything for everyone, everywhere, all at once, which is true. My worry, launching a big reorganisation on top of trying to do multiple other things, it's a distraction. There was a reason that they said in opposition they weren't going to whole-scale reorganise. Anyone who's run any organisation knows how distracting this sort of activity is. So my worry is, and it's being borne out to a degree, talking to system leaders, what's filling their time and their hours, thinking about redundancy programmes, thinking about reshaping activity rather than driving improvements. I can understand the logic for why they're suggesting a slimming down and suggesting a coming together. I worry about trying to do everything all at once, because no one can do that. And ultimately, you can only ever have a few priorities if you really want to deliver. And I was really struck. Woolnough O'Brien came to our annual conference last year, and she made this point so powerfully about time marching on. 4% of the parliament had already gone. And so often, that first year, 18 months, you've got to make choices, be clear on your priorities. You can never deliver as much as you want to. And the worry with this mass reorganisation is that there's a lot of worrying about jobs, reorganising structures, which diverts from shifting pathways of care, doing and delivering the transformation we want to see.
I absolutely agree with everything you've said about the people. I mean, I get it every day when I publish. I get 10 or 15 letters a week from people who are at their wits' end to know whether or not they're going to have a job. I had one this morning from a single mum with 2 kids doing a middle management role. She said, I don't know whether I can get a Mars. I don't know whether I'm going to be made redundant. I've got my rent to pay. People are genuinely distressed by this. The engine room of the NHS, they're worried sick about their jobs. And I think people like you and the King's Fund, you should say to Streeting, this is no way to run anything. Never mind our most important public sector. You are destroying it. To come in on a promise to say we're not going to change things and then within a few months tell her half the people are going to lose their jobs, but we don't know which half. This is a dreadful, thuggish way. And I think you should say that. And I don't know why you, the Nuffield Trust, and all the rest of them who have huge influence don't say that. Answer me this question. How much of your income do you get from the Department of Health?
Barely any. So we have one small contract that's coming to an end, which is with an academic partner for some research. We are in the very fortunate position, the power of independence and being able to speak truth to power. And there are different variations and ways you can do that. And there's the kind of insider versus outsider. But we are clear what we think about some of these issues. There clearly is a disconnect, understatement, between where we need to be from an NHS staff and workforce perspective and where we are at the moment. And it's even interesting in the order in which they're addressing some of these issues. So we're expecting another workforce plan, which we're told will be very different from the last workforce plan, but not yet. We have said consistently, your people, your staff, really investing in the workforce from a leadership development, training, morale perspective should be top of the agenda. And I will just say, probably the most powerful moments I've had since joining the fund have been sat in rooms listening to leaders talking about what it feels like, the moral injury of making up, or not making up, but, not being able to be totally transparent on finance for fear of being put in a certain bucket that's going to require more performance attention.
Do you think the NHS is being well run at the moment?
I think there are pockets of the NHS which are brilliantly run.
No, the NHS, not locally. Do you think this is the right way to go about this?
I would have made some different choices, but it is a really hard hand they've been dealt. I do acutely appreciate the money situation. If I can give one example, I was on a webinar with public health directors and Jim joined that webinar and we were talking about disinvestment that's happening now in public health in the NHS, in tobacco control programmes. And the harsh reality is they've got to balance the books this year. Sometimes there's a circle that can't be squared, but would I have pulled the trigger on throwing everything up in the air in the way that has been done? I think in opposition, they said they weren't going to do this for a reason, which is you want to drive improvements in service, you want patients and people to feel different, you want your workforce to feel better looked after, then you make different choices.
I want to move away from the King's Fund and its relationship with government and the tone of its responses. But just one final question on this, because I think Royce put his finger on a particular button, and that is the dilemma you face, which is in private, you may be going, these league tables are absolutely dreadful. They are a bad idea. This reorganization is dreadful. It is going things totally the wrong way. The question is the tone that you use, and to say it is the same for me, and I think it was the same for Chris Ham and indeed his successor as well. You always have this balance. You need to keep talking to government. So you need to keep an open relationship with them. That doesn't mean you're dishonest, but it probably means that you're not as brutal in public, although you could attract lots of headlines for doing that. But that actually would probably result in a complete deterioration of the relationship, and actually your influence might go away. Do you recognize the dilemma that I'm putting to you at all?
Yeah, I do, but I would characterise it differently, which is, and, personally, I've always tried to be constructive. I want things to be better for people and patients and staff. I want the health service and I want the health and care system to be better. What's the best way to achieve that? Well, it's a great privilege to be at the King's Fund because partly we can take a long-term view, we can show difference, we can have conversations with leaders to try and drive difference that way. When it comes to commentating, I suppose what I recognise is there's a bit of truth often in different positions. And to give you an example, I worked in cancer care for a long time. When I first started working on cancer policy, everything ran out of the Department for Health. And it was straightforward at national level. You knew who was accountable. There was a clear national programme. There was a national action team, cancer networks. You knew who to go to talk about screening and vaccination, all the rest of it. And then post-Lansley reform, there was this splintering and confusion and duplication to a degree. And it became harder to navigate as somebody trying to work with the system. So there is some truth in the fact that structures have been duplicative. I can see a rational argument for we're trying to tidy up, we're trying to reduce duplication, we're trying to get clearer advice. We're trying to be honest about the fact that the NHS will always be highly political and you want a clear line of sight to politicians. So I can see a rational argument. So I think some of the time we're trying to be balanced and genuinely be informed by evidence. I don't think we're trying to not say what we think so that we can kind of keep an in. I think we're trying to be constructive.
Question then would be, are you actually being frank about the fact that social care reform has been kicked down the road? Are you being frank about the fact that the funding envelope, which is going forward, is a fraction of what it was under the new Labour years when they did actually achieve a whole series of objectives? Are you being frank about the level of distress, which we've already talked about, among staff? So I guess it's partly a tonal thing, and I'm not attacking you for it. I think I'm understanding how you go about it. But I believe that part of that is that you have to maintain a relationship with government. And if you went on the offensive on all these issues all the time, then you risk that relationship.
There's a degree of that, but we've been very frank on social care. And it's a huge disappointment that government has kicked the can down the road. We've been very frank on public health and said the mission sort of vanished without trace. And there's been a lack of political courage to go further on some of the regulatory measures which might make a difference to population health. On your point about tone, I think Jennifer also referenced this. There is something about quite a alpha male aggressive tone emanating from parts of government at the moment. We don't have to emulate that or replicate that to make our point. And I always keep in mind patients and the public and what is going to make the difference for them. And so that's one of the reasons I took issue with the league tables, because I come at it from what will help people choose and get access to the best treatment. So I think, yeah, of course, we want to retain a relationship with government because we want to drive change in the world. But I wouldn't mistake sometimes doing so in a relatively polite way with not being clear. And there's also lots of conversations that will happen in private.
I don't think, just my opinion, but I don't think Streeting is listening. And I think we're not really getting the organ grinder. The organ grinder is Alan Milburn, because we're seeing a replication now of Milburn's policies, most of which were dumped by Labour themselves because they were useless. And he's back again now. And I wrote about Health Watch this morning, and he got rid of the CHCs last time round. You can see where this is going. I mean, I've got nothing to lose. I don't want anybody's money. I don't want a knighthood. I don't want to just write what I think. But I just think that organisations with the clout of the King's Fund, I would like to see them be much more brutal in what they say. I don't think there's any point in trying to wrap up anything for West Streeting. I mean, maybe I'm wrong to expect this, Sarah. I don't understand what the King's Fund is for if it doesn't call out things that are so blatantly, obviously 24-karat gold stupid.
I think we do, and I think we are. And I think, we might do it in a slightly different way from some of our predecessors, but I think we've been very clear what we think on a whole host of things. I also think health secretaries will come and go. I very much hope the King's Fund will be here in 20, 30 years' time in the way that it's been a companion during the course of my career. I've looked at it for advice and guidance and best practice. If we're really hungry for change, and you write about this, Roy, what also drives change? Partly it is working with the system. It's working with leaders. It's shining a light on best practice. It's international convening. It's hosting events. It's being a place where people can come and chew over and discuss and learn from one another. So what's the King's Fund for? Well, it's also for all of that stuff. This isn't just about a conversation with the single politician. It's about genuinely knowing what it means to create change and make it happen. And if I have an overarching criticism or critique of what's happened over the past year, we've had months and months of strategizing and conversations, public conversations not quite as squeaky as they need to be, and not anywhere near enough focus on how. Care closer to home. Well, we've been talking about the same issue, the same problem for at least 3 decades. Have we at scale delivered care closer to home? No. So what's it going to take to drive that change? I'm interested in making change happen. Partly that's about having a conversation with the Secretary of State. Partly it's about working with communities and groups of health and care leaders to drive change on the ground and then spotlight it, champion it.
You mentioned the BMA, and I just wondered how you regarded the industrial action by doctors and possibly nurses coming, and what should Wes Streeting do? Is this about fight or settle?
Well, goodness, it's a tough one. I think he was right early on to act. I think you read his speech on Sunday, and I think he laid out pretty clearly where we are, which is we are in a really challenging financial climate. Maybe the bigger question for an organisation like us is, how do we have a better national conversation about the kind of workforce and the skill mix that we'll need in future, and really think about how you support the workforce in all its guises. So, we talk a lot about compassionate leadership. We talk a lot about flexibility for staff and some stuff around pay. It's a very tough one. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes on this, but the reality is he can't possibly meet all of the pay demands in the timescale requested. So, there's going to have to be compromise on both sides.
He's negotiating a 3-year deal. That's what I've been told. Sorry, Neil, go on.
No, I was just going to say the fact is he compromised in inverted commas when he came in, when he moved from the previous government's position. And if he is compromising, he's compromising again. And I'm sure the view of the RCN will not be wholly sympathetic if he's seen to be giving the doctors more of what they want, whereas the nurses are being denied it. Let me ask you another kind of hard question, I guess. Have you any sympathy for pharma as it packs its bags and shakes its head, regretting what they see as the unreal expectations overpricing? Because it is clear from the industrial strategy, the one under the previous government and indeed this administration, that pharmaceuticals and medical technology and so forth are absolutely central to the whole growth agenda and all the rest of it. And now on a daily basis, we seem to be hearing of the industry deciding not to invest.
Yeah. Well, I've talked to lots of pharma leaders. Where I have sympathy is I think they feel they've been led up the garden path and then there's been a lack of delivery. So initially, the rhetoric from government is very much, we want the UK to be absolutely the destination, the place that you stay and invest. And yet we're going to stick to our guns on the percentage of spend on medicines, and the environment isn't going to shift as much as you would like it to. So I think there has been a disconnect between what perhaps was promised or what they thought the deal was and in reality what the deal can be. So I think there is immense frustration. There's anger because I think they feel let down. But I do sometimes think, do some of the leaders put themselves in the shoes of NHS leaders, which is, look, in a limited budget, we have to make hard choices and hard decisions. I hate to see the disinvestment. I've worked closely in medical research charities with pharma to drive brilliant innovation in life sciences. We do retain some great strengths, but we do appear to be sort of losing the global battle on some of this stuff. Maybe there was an inevitability about it when you look at our public finances, but I think it does feel as though trust is fractured.
So what should the government do?
Well, I think they should be honest. They've either got to find some money from somewhere or say, we're going to be the sort of country that spends 9%. And, we'd love you to stay and invest and we'll do other things. To be fair, you read the life science sector plan, you read the industrial strategy. I thought the 10-year plan did a good job of knitting together life sciences and health, all of the endless strategies that we have to, reduce time to set up clinical trials and really think about regulation intelligently, and finally crack medtech from a nice perspective. I actually think there's quite a lot of good policy in this area. I think there's been a good national conversation about what's the problem we're trying to diagnose here. We're great at basic research, we're slow to adopt. How do we speed that up? The circle that can't be squared here is the money, unless a rabbit's pulled out of a hat. But if the Secretary of State's saying it's above his pay grade, this really is a sort of Treasury number 10 decision on medicine spend.
Look, if we can't pay our doctors because we haven't got any money, we're certainly not going to be able to pay farmers. The issue here is Trump, isn't it? He's shot a hole right through the 10-year plan because he's saying unless you come here and reduce the price to here, then you're going to be in big trouble.
Can I just ask probably my final question? Just looking at that funding envelope, which we've talked about, in your estimation, can this government transform health and care, which is promised to do, within the funding envelope that they've set? Yes or no?
It would be unprecedented if they did it within this funding envelope, bearing in mind the heavy lifting they're saying has to be done from productivity gains and other forms of transformation. So I worry, but I would like to make the point that not all transformation and system change requires more money. And I do accept we got to get away from that narrative. I've seen brilliant examples over the years. You can drive real change without ever increasing budgets, but the settlement is really tough.
But Sarah, isn't it the case that what is happening here is Jim is sacking half the staff to create the financial headroom to invest in all this? The Treasury won't play because they won't give him the money for the redundancies. He announced the redundancies without doing the deal with the Treasury. That's what's gone wrong. And from what I'm told with the Treasury, and you probably have your own contacts, Treasury said to me, if the NHS want to make money by sacking people, good luck. We're not going to pay for it.
No, but what's one of the issues we're grappling with, this productivity puzzle, which is we've hugely increased staff numbers. We haven't driven the sort of productivity gain that, quite frankly, we do need to see. So I think there is pretty widespread acceptance. The answer can't always be more staff. And I think it's reasonable to say this is the spend you've got, do what you can with it. I think the difficulty is if there's a lack of kind of honesty from the politicians about what can be achieved. So one of the things the King's Fund's been really clear in saying is with this envelope, you can't do everything you are saying you will do. You can't re-meet all the constitutional standards. So make some choices. Be honest about what's top of the priority list. And ultimately, if that's not good enough, then you get back to, well, OK, is it taxation? What's the public and what are patients willing to pay for the sort of health service we want?
It's been really interesting to talk to you. And thank you for being so frank.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. That was great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well, as you say, Roy, that was an interesting session. A lot of parallels with what Jennifer Dixon was saying, perhaps unsurprisingly. And of course, her defence of trying to make quite hard comments about what the government is doing. And they clearly are critical in a whole series of areas. The question then is, as you rightly pointed out, is government listening? I think her question on the money worries me a bit because while I agree there's an awful lot that the health service can do, while I agree there are questions about productivity and extra staff going in and not seeing the dials move in the right way, there's no history of the NHS doing any kind of transformation at pace unless you pour significant amounts of money in. And that was the story of the New Labour years. Not saying it was all right, because I think an awful lot of the oil that they put into the engine ended up on the floor. But the reality was that they managed putting in huge extra money in every year. They managed to close lots of gaps that there had been between the UK and the rest of Europe. I really worry. I don't know what the tech will do. I don't know what this reorganisation will do, but it really worries me that with 2.8% or whatever it is, and even less in terms of capital, how do you achieve that fundamental change?
You can't do it. That's why Jim has bet the farm on sacking people, because 70% of our costs are people. If you get rid of your people, then you do create a huge amount of money. And the difficulty that he's got is he can't make a business plan stack up with the Treasury, because the Treasury is saying, listen, we know what happens. You just go and hire a load of consultants to come in and do what your people used to do. And there is no investment. He needs some upfront investment. And you're right at the end there when Sarah was talking about productivity. It's page 1 of the Economic Journal. How do you increase productivity? You invest in staff, not necessarily more staff. You invest in them to make them more skillful, and you invest in technology. And, we've got technology in the NHS where it spends 20 minutes waiting for the thing to warm up on the wards in the morning. But I think it's an unsquarable circle. And as far as Sarah, I thought she was really interesting, articulate, knows her stuff. I'm not convinced the King's Fund have any influence at all over what's happening in Whitehall. I think it's convenient for Streeting to pop along and make a speech because it'll get covered in the trade rags and maybe in the newspapers.
Would you go much harder? I mean, would that make a difference if they were ruder, more brutal, or whatever the word you want to use? Because the history of that generally has been that the government just shuts down, and the degree to which by them grabbing a few headlines. I mean, it'd be interesting if all three think tanks, the Health Foundation, Nuffield and King's Fund, got together and said, we don't think the government's on the right track here. Here are the 5 things that they need to get better. I would advocate that. But on the other hand, I also think there's a danger that Streeting would do exactly what you said he's doing anyway, which is ploughing on, because the political imperatives on him are so great.
But I think you're right. I mean, if we could get the 3 together to say what you're doing is wrong, as we did with the Lansley reforms, and the Lansley reforms were moderated and changed in part by a coalition of the people who really understood what they were thinking about. As far as we are now, no, I do think they should be more robust, which is why I asked the question, how much money do you get from the Department of Health? Because there was a time, I think it probably preceded you, but there was a time when they got a huge amount of money from the Department of Health for doing bits of work and consultancy and all the rest of it. That isn't the case now. And that's and that's good, because they're not dependent on the department for money. The King's Fund is richly endowed. The Nuffield Trust is richly endowed. You've got the Health Foundation. I mean, they seem to be okay for money as well. So
just to be clear on that, the Health Foundation has got huge amounts of reserves and money. Nuffield is smaller, and the King's Fund has got a bit more. On the other hand, the King's Fund, in terms of its income, is more dependent on its activity than it is on the fund itself. And I was responsible for part of that transformation, that it was our activity, our leadership development work, the work on conferences and all the rest of it, what brought in much more money than we were able to get during those years from the fund itself. And I imagine that is still the case. Where I think you've got to be careful, however, is where she says we don't get grants from government. Obviously, the King's Fund is relying on, through all its leadership courses, that's NHS money, if they're sending somebody from the NHS into it. So they're not. The Health Foundation is probably the one that sits above everything with hundreds of millions, and which has grown hugely over the last few years, I gather, as well. So they are in the very fortunate position of not even having to trade, as it were, in terms of their activity. On the other hand, as Sarah pointed out, I think the leadership work and the engagement work with local organisations means that they do become what I attempted to do during my time, to make it a think and do tank, not just a think tank.
Yes.
And she's absolutely right, in my view, that it's not the ideas. We've had all these ideas, as you pointed out, for year after year after year. It's how do you implement them, and how do we help people to implement them at speed and at scale. And that means not just having a few pilots. That's a waste of time. Well, it's not a waste of time, but you absolutely need large pilot areas if you're going to do it properly, and work out how you do this at scale. Because the story of so many of these pilots is that they run, people think they're sort of good, then they do another cost benefit analysis and find out, oh, well, there was actually quite a lot of money went into that. I'm not so sure. Oh dear, the money's tight. And so the thing stops. And that happens again and again.
I don't disagree with any of that, Neil. But what I think is happening now is we're destroying the workforce. We have no real plan of what the centre looks like. There's a huge row going on with the Treasury. And in the meantime, everything is falling apart. And I think it's really important that people whose opinion we value, and I think we could value Sarah's opinion, but these things need to be said, and the public need to understand that the people who really think about healthcare, the intellectuals behind the healthcare, are looking at this and they're saying, you know what, this isn't right. This needs to be sorted out. We need to put the brakes on. We need to focus on 2 or 3 things and get them done first. This needs to be said. But I've had a great time talking to you and talking to Sarah, and I hope listening, you've enjoyed it as well.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for listening, and look out for our next entry into the loop.